We all know this story, right? We all know how it ends. A kiss, a prince, a castle, the villain finally getting what she deserves. Well, what if I told you there's a version of this story that might actually be true? And this one ends with poison, a countess who died at 21, and a stepmother who was already dead years before any of it ever happened. So if you think you know Snow White, stay tuned because I don't think you know this part yet. The version most of us grew up with came from Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, two German scholars who spent years traveling the countryside collecting oral folk tales before anyone had bothered to write most of them down. Their story, first published in 1812 as Schneewittchen, gave us the shape we all recognize now. A queen obsessed with being the fairest in the land, a magic mirror that answers her, honestly, whether she wants the truth or not, and a stepdaughter whose beauty eventually outgrows her own. A huntsman sent into the forest to kill the girl who can't go through with it and lets her run. 7 small companions take her in. And finally, a poisoned apple that finishes with the mirror started, undone only by a prince and a kiss. Walt Disney's 1937 film softened almost everything about that story. And this is the version most people picture when they hear the name Snow White. What almost nobody talks about, though, is where the Grimms might have actually gotten it from. Because there's a real argument made by an actual historian that this fairy tale isn't invented at all. It's a woman's biography. In 1994, a German researcher named Eckhard published a book called Schneewittchen, Märchen, oder, Wahrheit, which translates to Snow White, fairy tale or truth. His argument was that the story traces back to a real 16th century countess named Margarita von Waldeck. And if you line her life up next to the fairy tale, the parallels are hard to dismiss as coincidence. Margarita was born in 1533 to Philip IV, Count of Waldeck-Wildingen, a small German territory in the region known as Hesse. Now, this wasn't known as a major European power. It was just a small noble territory that survived by staying useful to bigger families around it, which meant that marriages and alliances mattered enormously to people like Margarita's father. Her mother died when she was still a young child, and her father remarried a woman named Katharina von Hatzfeldt. By most accounts, Katharina did not get along with her stepchildren, and she reportedly had little patience for keeping them close, often sending them off to live with relatives instead of raising them under her own roof. So already we have the stepmother who wants nothing to do with her stepchildren, and it's the one detail that Sander leans on hardest. At 16, Margarita was sent away from home entirely, this time to Brussels in what's now Belgium. While she was there, she caught the attention of a young Spanish prince who would eventually become King Philip II of Spain, one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe at the time. He was ruling Spain, Portugal, and large parts of Italy, the Netherlands, and territories across the Americas. A romance between a minor German countess and the heir to that kind of empire was not something the political families on either side wanted. Royal marriages in the 16th century were rarely about affection. They were just means to secure alliances and settle debts, absorb smaller territories into larger ones, and an unplanned attachment between Philip and a countess with no political value to offer him threatened to complicate arrangements that people far more powerful than Margarita had already been negotiating. But Margarita died at 21. Sanders' claim, based on his research into the period, is that she was poisoned, and that Spanish agents were behind it, acting to make sure the relationship couldn't develop into anything Philip's family would need to formally address. Sudden deaths among politically inconvenient young women were not unheard of in this era, and poisoning in particular carried a grim reputation as the preferred method when a death needed to look natural, or at least not obviously violent. That alone would make for a sad, mostly forgotten piece of German nobility trivia. One countess among hundreds who died young and inconveniently close to powerful men. But what turns it into something that actually resembles Snow White is what came next in Sanders' research. Margarita's father owned several copper mines in the region, and those mines were worked almost entirely by children. Child labor in 16th century mining was brutal by any modern standard, and copper mining specifically meant long hours underground in cramped, poorly ventilated shafts, hauling ore in conditions that stunted growth and wore down small bodies well before adulthood. Malnutrition was common, injuries went untreated, and life expectancy for these child laborers was short even by the standards of the period. Many who survived into adulthood never reached full height, a detail Sander points to directly when connecting these children to the 7 small figures of the fairy tale. The actual mining settlement where many of these children lived and worked still exists. It's now part of a town called Bad Wildungen, and the district built around the old mine is called Bergfreiheit, which loosely translates to Mountain Freedom. An almost bitterly ironic name given the conditions the children who lived there actually worked under. Historical accounts describe these child laborers often in groups of around 20 crammed into a single small dwelling. Bad Wildungen had leaned into the connection so heavily that it now brands part of itself as Schneewittchen, which literally means Snow White Village. So by Sander's telling, you have a jealous stepmother who sends a young girl away from home, a girl who falls for a powerful man in a way that threatens the political interests of people far above her, a death by poison meant to end the threat permanently, and a group of small child laborers living and working underground nearby in conditions severe enough to stunt their growth for life. Line those up next to the fairy tale, and it's easy to see why this theory has stuck around for 30 years and why it still gets cited in academic discussions of fairy tale origins instead of dismissed as just internet folklore. But here's where a real problem with the timeline shows up. If Katarina is meant to be the wicked stepmother orchestrating all of this, there's an issue. Because Katarina died in 1546. Margarita didn't die until 1554. That's 8 years apart. The stepmother who supposedly wanted her dead was already gone by the time the alleged poisoning actually happened. She was buried nearly a decade before her stepdaughter ever set foot in Brussels. So this detail pretty much unravels a one-to-one mapping between Margarita's life and the fairy tale. But it doesn't mean nothing about her life resembles Snow White. The child labor connection still holds regardless of who her stepmother was, right? But it does mean that the wicked stepmother orders her stepdaughter's death theory doesn't really match Margarita's actual documented life. I mean, you can't have the woman driving the murder plot already be a decade dead when the murder happens, and no version of Sander's research resolves that. But there are a couple of ways people have tried to explain the gap. One explanation is that whoever was actually behind the poisoning, whether Spanish agents trying to prevent the marriage or some other political actor entirely, got folded into the character of the stepmother over generations of oral retelling. A jealous woman ordering the death close to home is a far more compelling, far more human story than a distant political assassination carried out by agents the audience never sees or names. And folklore has a long history of collapsing complicated, faceless causes of death into a single recognizable villain the listener can actually picture. Another possibility is that 2 separate strands of local memory around Waldeck, one involving a real stepmother conflict from Margarita's childhood, and one involving her actual death years later in a different country, got fused together at some point before the Grimms ever collected the story. It read as one continuous narrative instead of 2 unrelated events that happened to the same woman. Alright, now get this. The Sanders Margarita theory isn't even the only serious contender here. There's a completely separate group of historians and local researchers based in a Bavarian town called Lora Mine who argue that Snow White is actually based on a different woman entirely. One born almost 200 years after Margarita and living under very different circumstances. Her name was Maria Sophia von Ertl, born in 1729. Her father, Philip Christoph, was a prince and a local landowner with a real standing in the region. And after Maria Sophia's mother died, he remarried a woman named Claudia Elisabeth, Countess of Reichenstein, who, by the accounts collected in lore, disliked her stepchildren very, very much. And yes, apparently it was very common for this type of behavior in that era where the stepmother was either jealous of the children or just didn't want anything to do with them. But what makes Lore's version of the theory genuinely compelling is a physical object that still exists today, which is more than either theory can say for a poisoned apple or a huntsman's blade. The town of Lore was known regionally for manufacturing especially fine mirrors. A real local industry with skilled craftsmen producing glass advertised at the time as reflecting a person's true image with unusual clarity, compared to the cloudier, cheaper mirrors most households would have owned. Some of these were even built as acoustic novelty pieces rigged with a mechanism that let them seem to respond or answer back to whoever stood in front of them. An unsettling parlor trick for anyone who didn't know how it worked. a mirror manufactured specifically in this town, built to seem uncannily honest and even capable of speech, sitting in the same household where the stepmother conflict supposedly played out. This is a much harder coincidence to dismiss. Now, the castle Maria Sophia's family lived in still stands today as a museum open to visitors, and it still displays the kind of mirror the theory is built around, giving people a physical object to point to. So now there are two towns, two noble families, two young women whose lives brushed up against tragedy or mistreatment in ways that compare to the fairy tale. And one story, and both regions have spent years arguing over which of them actually inspired the version the Grimms eventually wrote down. So there's one more layer to this, and it might change how you think about both of these theories. The basic shape of Snow White, a persecuted young woman, a jealous older woman, an escape into hiding, some kind of magical restoration, existed long before either Waldeck in the 1500s or lore in the 1700s. The pattern goes back much further than either woman's lifetime. Roman mythology includes a figure named Chione, whose name literally translates to snow. Chione's story was recorded centuries before either Margarita or Maria Sophia were born. It involves a woman so beautiful that she draws dangerous attention from powerful figures, ultimately leading to tragedy driven by jealousy. It's not a one-to-one match with the Grimm story, but the naming parallel. An ancient figure whose name means snow, caught up in a story about beauty provoking jealousy and danger, is exactly the kind of system folklorists look for when they trace a fairy tale back further than any single historical person. Story patterns like this tend to travel across centuries and borders through oral tradition long before anyone writes them down, picking up new local details every time they land somewhere new. While the underlying skeleton, beauty, jealousy, exile, restoration, stays essentially the same. So what probably actually happened? People who've actually studied how the Grimm brothers collected their stories tend to come away with a less dramatic picture than any of us want to hear, I guess. It's somewhere more complicated than a single true crime origin story. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm didn't invent Snow White from nothing, but they also weren't transcribing a single woman's biography word for word. Their method, documented across the collection process for most of their tales, involved traveling through German-speaking regions and gathering variations of the same basic story from different informants, often literate middle-class women who had heard these tales from their own families, then blending the versions that felt most complete or most compelling into a single narrative that eventually got published in 1812, and revised across later editions. So given that method, the most likely explanation is that it was just a bunch of stories put together. So we can take the same skeleton that produced Chione centuries earlier, mix it with pieces of Margarita's real story, the mines, the being sent away from home, the death that conveniently benefited people with far more power than she had, likely attached themselves to that older pattern and circulated as local legend around Waldeck for generations. Separately, pieces of the lore story, the disliked stepchildren, the uncanny truthful mirror sitting in an actual castle, attached themselves to the same underlying pattern and circulated around Bavaria. By the time the Grimms were collecting stories in the 1800s, all of that had probably blended together into something that felt like one continuous tale, even though it was built from fragments. So, two very different regions of Germany and a mythological root system stretching back to ancient Rome. Which one is the real Snow White? I truly believe they all are, but let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. This is Danny reminding you that every story holds a hint of truth or a shadow of legend. Until next time, stay curious and keep the lights on. And please be sure to share, like, hype, comment, and subscribe as it helps my channel to grow. See you in the next one.